Welcome to Tea Time with the Jackson Center. I am Kristen McMahon, and I have the pleasure of serving as the president of the Robert H. Jackson Center in Jamestown, New York. We envision a world where the universal principles of equality, fairness, and justice prevail. 2021 is an important recognition year for Justice Jackson, for international humanitarian law, and for the Jackson Center itself. And during the course of this year, we have celebrated the 80th anniversary of Justice Jackson's appointment to the Supreme Court, the completion of the 75th anniversary of the International Military Tribunal at Nuremberg and the birth of international humanitarian law, and the 20th anniversary of the Robert H. Jackson Center. And all of those milestones and our planning to commemorate or celebrate them had us looking to the past to see how far we, the law, and the world have come. But we know we cannot simply rest on our laurels, so it also sparked conversations about where we are headed and how we get there. And that is part of the story of how we got to our programming theme for 2021, the work left to do. During this year, we are convening conversations about democracy, US and global institutions, human rights, and equity. We have structured our teas a little bit differently this year, and each month has a particular focus. In November, we are looking at immigration and refugee justice. The first tea each month, which this is geared to provide you with an understanding of the work left to do to achieve equity or make progress via the law in this area. And the second tea each month is geared to showcase those actively doing the work to close those gaps. And in this tea, we have a little bit of both. We hope each of these programs inspires you to have conversations with your family, friends, and colleagues, and to seek out ways to make change in your own communities. So today, I am excited to be in conversation with Alan Orr and Karen Siciliano Lucas. Alan is the 2021-2022 president of the American Immigration Lawyers Association and one of its national spokespeople. He is also the founder of Orr Immigration Law Firm, PC, in Washington, D.C. Karen is the Immigration Justice Campaign Director at the American Immigration Council. The Justice Campaign is a joint initiative between the American Immigration Council, the American Immigration Lawyers Association, and the American Immigrant Representation Project. Alan and Karen, thank you so very much for joining me for tea today.
Thank you for having me. I'm super excited. It's also our 75th anniversary at AILA, so celebrating a lot of things together.
Congratulations. Thank you. So I like to start each of these with what I call the ground setting question. And so I'm going to ask each of you, and Alan, I will start with you. How do you define immigration justice or refugee justice?
Right. So for me, we're a lawyers association, so we're 15,000 lawyers, and so what we're based on is basically the law, and what our rules are basically that there's due process of those laws. So as long as we're following the rules as they are made and promulgated by Congress, then for us, and you're having an ample resource to get through that, then we see that as justice. But as we know over time, justice sort of changes, right? Justice isn't something that sort of steals, so it sort of morphs. So there isn't just one thing, but for us, it's the due process to avail those individuals seeking that right, seeking the ability to do that under the current laws. That's what we sort of angle for every time.
Okay. And Karen, what is your perspective on that?
Sure. So the American Immigration Council was actually founded by AILA to increase our ability to bring systemic change and to go beyond helping individual immigrants with their cases, but to really make systemic change, to change the way that Americans think about immigration, act toward immigrants, and to create the structures in our law and in our society that really support everyone to thrive, to be able to exercise their rights, to be able to seek protection under the law, and to be able to make a home in a welcoming society. And so for us, I think that's our core and our justice, and it's very much related to our partner, AILA.
And just given the last 20 months that we have been living under, has COVID changed these conversations, or has it changed either of your organization's focus on how you answer these questions or how you make progress towards justice? And Karen, I think I'll start with you on that one.
Sure. Well, I think that this pandemic has sort of laid bare a lot of fault lines that have been, in our society for a long time, and have really shown us all of the many ways in which communities of color, immigrant communities are hurt in particular ways, are disadvantaged in their ability to bounce back from a situation like a pandemic in this society. And so one example, of course, is access to COVID relief packages. Another is access to adequate health care. Another is their ability to protect themselves and their health inside immigration detention centers. The Immigration Justice Campaign focuses on immigration detention and the fight to end immigration detention and bring us to a world in which we have other proven ways of supporting individuals who are in immigration proceedings so that they show up to all of their hearings and they have the transportation and access to the support that they need. And what we saw during the COVID pandemic was just how much those individuals in detention, really their lives are at risk from the immigration detention system and the inability to protect themselves and to be taken care of.
Alan, anything you'd like to add there?
Sure, I think that that's basically it. But also I like to add that COVID falls for me under the environmental concerns that are global. And what it helped to do was to illustrate in the United States the stress systems, but specifically injustice for everyone during COVID: access to court, access to justice, access to delay, being detained without the appropriate, being detained, and also sort of being a life sentence to death by not having the appropriate exposure or the classification for that. But it also reinitiated some of the challenges that you face, which are the differences between the different communities based on social background and ethnicity.
Okay, great. So before we get into some of the work that both of your organizations do, I also want to get a sense of why were your organizations established? And Karen, you talked a little bit about this in your intro. So I'm actually going to start with Alan on this one. I am interested in, 1946, when we think about it, the World War II has just ended. I have to imagine that there were a significant number of displaced persons for obvious reasons, and the world working through that. And so I'm curious, why was AILA established? And usually it's because some need was not being met. So what was it seeing in the world that an organization said, yes, we need to be?
Right. So our organization was founded by individuals who actually used to work for INS at the time, is what it was called, 14 of them. And they decided that they saw the need to sort of improve the system from the outside and give opportunities. And all of them were Jewish at the time. And so that is the growth of our organization, the focus that it sort of went from those founding individuals to the 15,000 that we are today. So we're here to be the global defenders, just like lawyers are in every other area of the law. And that was the goal and the mission. The need was to have people have representation through this very serious time of trying to immigrate to the United States.
Now I feel like we all need capes as well. I like the global defenders idea and the superheroes of the world, especially since tomorrow is Love Your Lawyer Day. Just in case people did not know that is a national holiday in the United States, November 5th this year, you can love your lawyer. So Karen, you had mentioned a little bit about how the Immigration Justice Campaign came to be, but also would love to understand the American Immigrant Counsel and how that organization came to be as well.
Sure. So the Immigration Counsel, when we were founded in 1987, I believe, there are a couple of central things that we were trying to do. We saw that we needed to get facts into the debate. The debate about immigration, especially these days, is enormously polarizing, and it was polarizing back then as well. And there was so much misinformation. And so a lot of what the American Immigration Counsel does is really go back to basics and try to correct some of the misinformation and the myths that are out there about immigration, about asylum seekers, to get facts into the debate. But the other things that we were trying to do are to bring a multi-pronged approach to actually creating systemic change. And so you can't do it with any one tool. You can't do it just with lawyers. You can't do it just with communication strategies. You can't just do it with policy change. You need to bring all of that together and have a multi-pronged approach. And so that's, again, really something that the American Immigration Council is trying to do. Now, in 2017, we and AILA saw ahead of us a real due process disaster that was about to hit us with, the Trump administration was leaning very heavily into deportation and enforcement and 15,000 lawyers are a mighty army, but we also saw that, my goodness, we've been in a situation where for the last 20 years, less than 20% of immigrants who are detained have access to a lawyer. And so we needed to rethink. We needed to completely rethink how we approached the question of advocacy for individuals who are in immigration detention in particular. And the immigration detention system has just grown and grown and grown since the early 1990s. But we really did see that it was going to expand even more under the Trump administration. And so the Immigration Justice Campaign was founded as the first joint initiative of AILA and the Council and our other partner, the American Immigrant Representation Project. And the goal was to activate a nationwide community of volunteers, not just lawyers, but also interpreters, translators, social workers, mental health providers, law students, activists, everyone it takes to support not only holistic representation for individuals in immigration detention, but also change across the country. And to activate them, to deploy them to defend immigrants who are in detention, and to, through that effort, educate more and more people about why immigration detention is unnecessary and enormously harmful, and why there are much better ways to do this. And so we now have over 13,000 volunteers across the country in almost every state. They speak 38 different languages. And we're growing every day.
That's great. And I will remind our audience that they do not need to wait until the end to ask questions. Feel free to put them into the chat at any time during our conversation today as they occur to you. I thought it might also be helpful for our audience to get a base understanding of immigration in the United States. I think that there is a conception that it is easy to immigrate to the United States. So I'd like to ask the experts, how easy is it? Is the system readily understandable? Is it something, 15,000 lawyers feels like a lot, but is that sufficient? And Alan, I think I'll start with you on that one.
Sure. It is mildly deficient, and the system is mildly underutilized and not updated. So I think part of the issue that we have is that, our immigration system is a Tandy computer. If you don't know what a Tandy computer is, then you're lucky enough to have been born in a world without it. But that's one of the original Radio Shack computers. And now that we are much more into the Apple world, we're still relying on the Tandy computer to do our immigration processing. So it makes it extremely difficult by limiting the categories and the ways to get into the United States. As we sit here today, it's been 35 years since we've updated our current immigration system. And as we know, things need to be updated. The same problems we have with our educational system not being reformed is the same problems we see here in immigration, that we're not meeting the needs of the individual people that we're trying to do, or the occupations that we're trying to reach today. And instead of looking at immigration as an opportunity, most times we look at it as a challenge or a crisis. And it has never been that. This country is built on immigration. So the concept should always be that this is an opportunity for us to build and to replenish our country. It's very complex. It's the next level of complex law under tax law. I originally started as an ERISA attorney, so know that I know for real that it's the complexities of it. And the other thing is the access to justice, right? Immigration courts are not exactly the real courts, which is something that we push for, which is reform to justice, as well as in many cases, people are making decisions without any level of review at consulates around the world just because that's the freedom we've always given them. And that's not exactly the right way to sort of say, if this is your opportunity to come to the United States, is that really a just way to present it, where someone can arbitrarily decide in whatever country, we're just going to keep these people out for whatever reason. So it's very complex and very difficult. And part of it is it's just not modern.
We did get a question from Donna that seems to fit in nicely here as well. And she asks, are there organizations or people in the countries where people are trying to leave that are set up with the protocols or understand the protocols that could help them before they leave? So it's not just after they get to the United States and end up either on one side of the border or the other in a detention center, or maybe waiting on the other side of the border. Are there organizations or other people working on that to help smooth out the front part of this process?
Karen, do you want this, or do you want me? I can take it.
You can take it and then I can add. Sure.
Okay, so first, bad assumption is that people who come here and overstay their visas are people who are showing up at the border. That's not true. Most people who overstay are people who had a visa at one point and they just had no option because the system's so antiquated, there was no way for them to sort of stay and remain in the society and to sort of have their job here. Part of the build of the current immigration system and asylum was one that there is a large refugee sort of world to sort of say, let's do this refugee processing. It takes about 2 years and it's very under-resourced right now. And so the concept of telling individuals who are fleeing for their lives in most cases that if you could just wait a little while longer, or gang violence or whatever it may be, their situation, if you could wait just a little bit longer where you are for some relaxation or some relief, then that would be good. So part of the give and the balance of being a good citizen in North America, not just the United States, is that many of the challenges that we face on the continent are those that were created by mostly the United States. So some of the situations are also created, the gang violence, the lack of a control leader. You can look at any of the countries. Let's look at Haiti, for example. The United States has had a hand in that since the very beginning, which has led to these different levels of failure from the government, which leads to the problem that the people have there and allowing the gangs to rise up and sort of take over the society there. So part of the issues are that, yes, there are ways for this country, and that's something that the Biden administration recently put back into place, processing abroad. But that also gives you the assumption, believe, that someone who walked 1,000 miles could have stayed somewhere and just waited a little bit of time. People who are walking 1,000 miles aren't doing that because there's an urgency. There is an urgency about that. It is not the type of urgency that's addressed by the current refugee program. And part of that is many individuals who I have encountered in this process who come that way aren't necessarily doing it by choice. They're not coming because they think the United States is just a beacon of hope, but they're coming because the opportunity to sort of have freedom to live. They would gladly stay in the country in which they were born if the conditions were different via the environment or the political situation. So that's part of the assumption with those things. The other issue are there are just some people who came here, like I said before, those who overstayed their visas, that they come in, they have the money, they have the resources, and they've just decided they want to stay, but there's no route for them to get to their citizenship. And that's much of the challenge of an outdated system. So everyone who's here that is undocumented, there could have been legal options for them that if Congress were to move forward, there would be. But everybody who comes isn't necessarily applying for asylum or some form of relief. And those numbers are in the balance. So when we think about immigration, the immigration population, don't just think about the southern border. Remember, there's a northern border and there's tons of airports which people come into every day.
Karen, anything you wanted to add? Yeah.
Sure. Just to add to that, I mean, Congress has to update our immigration system. It's just, as Alan said, completely antiquated. And actually, one of our most popular fact sheets is, why don't they just get in line? And the answer is because there isn't a line, because that's not a thing, because our systems do not work in that way, where you would think that there should be an actual way for people to come here if they want to and prosper, but they can't in many, many cases. And even when they can, the visa backlogs are just tremendous that it's not even a real option for someone. And, if you are in a situation like this, where our laws are so antiquated and they are so complicated, as Alan says, you couple that with the fact of our current system, which is that individuals who are going through this do not have the right to a publicly funded lawyer. They don't have guaranteed legal representation. And so there are individuals who are facing deportation, who are facing removal back to extremely dangerous situations, who are not able to find a lawyer, cannot afford a lawyer, and they have to proceed on their own with a really difficult process. And so there's a lot for Congress to do.
Is it that immigration is harder now, or does it just feel that way? I'm curious, historically, when we're talking about the levels of immigration currently in the United States, how does that compare to what it was 35 years ago, or even earlier than that? Have these laws sort of always not been keeping up? And even 35 years ago was good enough, but just curious as to historically, what kind of cycle are we in?
So I don't think it's a cycle. I think it's a mode. And the mode is that we politicize immigration, which it never should have been in the first place. So the concept of people appearing at our southern borders has happened for many years. That's nothing new. One of the things that happened during the Reagan administration is that we decided that we were going to criminalize this and make some bars. So what would happen would people would come and work and then they leave, and that was the way that it worked before the Reagan bill. After the Reagan bill, people couldn't leave because if they were to leave, then they would be subject to these bars that were 3 and 10 years and they wouldn't be able to come back in. So that was a bad decision at the time, and it has proven to be that way historically, and just its impact on different people. So that way it isn't exactly the most fluid to the society. So that coupled with the environmental concerns that we discussed earlier that go beyond, earthquake, poverty, gangs, all those things that are sort of created have led to immigration being difficult. But the reason it's difficult isn't because it's something that's not solvable, right? We're going to Mars here in this country. It's because we're not focused on a resolution for it. Because every year, whether it be a Democrat or Republican, they play political games with individuals who are othering them. And one of the things that I think in this conversation is that what built America wasn't this concept of a sum zero game, right? It isn't if one immigrant comes, they take a job away from someone else. When you're building a society, the more people you have in that society doing different things, like the way New York was built, or the way Chicago was built, or the way LA was built, that's part of the foundation of this country, sort of having this building of many different occupations and people sort of filling in jobs. And right now we have so many jobs that could be met by immigrants who would gladly do those jobs and then maybe support the people back home and maybe change the economy back home. But because our system doesn't have any availability for that, there's no option to just say, I just want to come be a truck driver and leave, or I just want to come help you get the things out of the field, or healthcare, or any of the other jobs that we needed to be filled. Then that's what makes this a challenging conversation. In addition, when people also start thinking of immigration right now, they immediately think of criminal. And that's not the way to think about criminal. When people originally think about Christopher Columbus, they don't think about him as a criminal necessarily, some groups do, but you think about them as taking an opportunity, being an explorer, doing what's right for the family, doing what's right for the history of a country or of a nation, of a tribe. And that's what many of these individuals are trying to do, just do what's right by their families. So one of the things that's missing in immigration right now is the empathy to understand that these people are also humans. And what would you do in these very complex situations? And the way that we could address it is a way that works for both of us, because what immigrants do to this country has never been anything about taking away. It's always been about adding.
I think that is an important part of the conversation, and something that doesn't get a whole lot of thought, or certainly a whole lot of public airtime in terms of those attributions. I think it was on Ayla's website that it's something about 1 in 7 citizens is an immigrant. And when you consider the population of the United States, that's an astonishing number of people. Karen, anything you wanted to add?
No, I think Alan really covered it. I mean, the laws fundamentally changed in really damaging ways in 1986 and 1996. And we've seen the damage, and we know how to change the system. And we know, what aspects of the law criminalized the movement of people, took discretion away from immigration judges to do the right thing. We know what laws created the terrible situation we're in right now, and we know how to rewrite them.
Okay. So we have touched on some of the education efforts of Ayla, which I know is one of their core tenets. Are there other conceptions about immigrants or the immigration policy of the United States that you feel it would be important for our audience to think more about or dig in deeper with?
So for me, so I'm the first Black president of ALA, and I'm American, I have an immigrant background, but that's so important. I was born here in Georgia. And I'm also openly gay. And I think when we start thinking about minorities within minorities, that we should also look at how justice treats those minorities. And so what generally happens in this country is the largest minority group gains into the majority, they get their justice and they forget about everyone else. But I think what this last year has shown us, specifically for Black immigrants, is how justice, no matter whether it be criminal justice, housing justice, or employment equities, it still impacts those communities the same when they're from different countries, but they still share some of the characteristics of the groups of native-born citizens here. So in these conversations, when we talk about—
That would be something that intersectionality is, sorry, go ahead.
No, I think it's super important. I think that remember that when we have these conversations, immigrants are always included, because, when you think about the 1 in 7 in certain places, or you think about New York's population, a large percentage of those individuals are immigrants. And as we move forward, there's only going to be more.
Well, in our audience, most of our conversations this year, although we have been focused on specific themes each month, really the conversation has been about the intersectionality and how very few people are only ever one thing. And that the layers that you add to each person complicate both how the law treats them and how the law impacts them. And so that will be a familiar concept for our audience. Karen, you had mentioned in your intro that the Immigrant Justice Campaign is working towards ending the detention center system. So I'm curious about what are the alternatives to this? I feel like we've been living with this system for so long. It's honestly the only system I can think of in terms of how we handle this. So what are the alternatives?
I mean, the immigration detention system that we have right now is actually relatively new and has a very specific history. And so that is something that, I definitely want people to understand, which is that, from all the way through 1980, we had very, very little detention of immigrants in the United States. And you can see the rise in the creation of immigration detention capacity at the same time that you see the rise in the mass incarceration system that within the United States generally. And so the immigration detention system that we have is really part and parcel of the epidemic of mass incarceration and the history of mass incarceration in the United States. So much of this came with the 1990s laws that over-policed and over-criminalized communities of color. They created laws that criminalized immigrants, but they also created actual immigration detention bed mandates that mandated a certain number of immigration detention beds. And now the vast majority of immigration detention across the country is actually run by the private prison companies that are making money hand over fist over the incarceration of communities of color. And states like California have been ahead of the game in trying to pass laws to kick private prison companies out of the immigration detention system, to try to restrict the ways in which we utilize and pair the prison system in the United States with the immigration detention system in the United States. And the reality is that individuals who have legal counsel show up to all of their hearings, 96%. We had a study that we did with some academics that looks at 10 years of immigration court data. And it shows that, overall 80-something% of immigrants showed up for all of their immigration court hearings, but with an attorney, 96% of them did. And we know from, community-based organizations and faith-based organizations that have been working for decades, for generations, to provide community-based support, case management support, social service support for newcomers we know that those systems work to make sure that folks can figure out how to get their kids enrolled in school, to make sure that they understand where their court hearing is happening, and what is the transportation that they're going to be able to avail themselves of to get there. And these systems have been run in the community-based sector, in the nonprofit world, for decades, and they are underinvested in. And legal representation is underinvested in. And instead, what Congress has invested in is very, very costly immigration detention. Much of that goes into the pockets of private prison companies. And so this is not an argument that should be polarizing. It's very bipartisan. It's very clear cut that this is an inhumane and wasteful use of taxpayer money, when you know that there are other ways to create and support a system with integrity, and one that is humane.
I did not realize the close ties between the immigrant detention and incarceration systems as well. That's interesting information. So Karen, it sounds then, with regard to how the Justice Campaign does it work, that those partnerships, and maybe it is partnerships with some of those faith-based organizations or local organizations as part of the cadre of volunteers in the campaign, becomes increasingly important, I think, on both sides of the coin. So they have long experience in this, some of them, and can contribute that information and knowledge and what works. And also then infinitely expands the impact that AILA and AIC and your third partner can have in their reach as well. Is that a correct way of thinking about it?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And so, step one, of course, is to make sure that individuals who are caught up in the detention system are able to get legal representation and are able to get released. That is, step number one. And then step number two is, how do you expand the pool of the network, really, of both individuals and community-based organizations, public and private, who are coming together to support a system that does not rely on immigration detention. And the Immigration Justice Campaign does all of our work in local national partnership. And so when we are deploying volunteer lawyers and social workers to detention centers in El Paso, we are doing that in close partnership with the organizations on the ground that have been serving those communities for a very long time. And the same thing in San Diego and in Louisiana and in Georgia and in Colorado and in all of the places in which we work.
Okay. Alan, we have a question for you, and this is from Helena, and she is curious about the statement you made that immigration courts are not real. And so she wondered what exactly you meant by that. Is that they are not equipped to perform their functions, they're understaffed, or is there's some other element to that caused you to say that?
Excellent question. So what they are not, are they are not independent, right? So in justice, in every form of justice that I know, the court system is independent from the police system, and it's not sort of in control of the police or governed by the policer. So immigration courts fall under the authority of the Department of Justice, and therefore the Attorney General actually can pull the strings in courts, reopen cases, and rewrite judge opinions. And those judges work for them. And so the judges are instructed to process things by a certain date or to have a certain opinion about those things. So that independent nature sort of moves apart. In addition to that, the judge and the attorney who's presenting the case and the person who locked them up all work for the same person. So in my world, that doesn't represent an independent justice system where people can have the equities they deserve to get the right sort of due process.
Yeah, and I would just add, in addition to that, the Judge Dana Marks, who used to head up the Union of Immigration Judges, used to call it, and I hope I'm getting this right, but traffic court with death penalty consequences. Essentially, the judges themselves had so little ability to make fair calls because of the ways that the law has restricted their discretion, that in many cases they felt disempowered to do the right thing. And, you know, something also that contributes to this imbalance and in this inequity in the immigration court system that you would never see in a federal court system is that individuals actually don't get automatic access to the records that the government has on them. They have to go through the long process of going through the Freedom of Information Act and requesting their records, and there's such a backlog, and very often they don't get their records until well after the hearing even takes place. If you are in one of the immigration court facilities that is inside, co-located in a detention center, the trial attorney for ICE will have access to all of the records there, will be able to bring in their laptop, will be able to bring in their phone. Lawyers for the respondents are not able to bring in their laptops. They are not able to bring in their phones. So there is a structural inequity in the way that the immigration court system operates because it is not independent, because it is not like a federal court that really works to the disadvantage of immigrants going through these proceedings.
And that's the very first proposition that AILA is working to change in that arena, right? So that's issue number one.
And I was going to ask, what are some of the paths forward? So what are some, I mean, independence obviously seems like a top priority, but how exactly do you go about separating that system that has been in existence for maybe not since the 80s, but has been in existence for a number of years now, and give it greater independence? Yeah,
so I'll take that in carrying the course. You know, when you think about the modern day immigration system, it started after September 11th. We rebuilt everything. So it's not like it's some old thing that it's difficult to change, right? It's immigration itself isn't difficult to change. It's about will and choice. So we have other court models that are similar that we can use to sort of make this transition. But in that, the transition isn't justice or isn't fair for me, even under our own constitutional rules. Whether how difficult it is to change it shouldn't be the deterrent to doing it, right? And we have a large backlog currently in the immigration court system, millions of cases that could easily be resolved by saying, okay, we're gonna start this new system and we're gonna start it working appropriately in an appropriate fashion. So if we wanted to build it, much like we built DHS, we could do it and have just judges and being there. So part of the reason why there aren't a lot of immigration judges is because there isn't the freedom to be a judge, right? That's why the capacity is low and people think, I don't want this job where someone's gonna tell me what justice is and I'm supposed to be a judge. So that's the challenge that is there, is the willpower. It's not the burden of how we do it. The United States has never had a problem of changing anything to meet the needs of a problem, and COVID is the primary example.
Agreed.
And Karen, just to add to that, I think that funding is also a critical component of it. If you look at the imbalance in the funding that has gone to the enforcement operations of the Department of Homeland Security versus the immigration court functions in the Department of Justice, it's astounding, and it's a choice, as Alan said.
Got it. Well, and Alan, so this leads me to another one of AILA's core tenets, which you alluded to as well, is that it advocates for fair and reasonable immigration policy. And also as a lawyer, I'm always struck when people use fair and reasonable to understand first what is meant by fair and reasonable for AILA.
Right. So I can't give you an answer because I'll give you the Supreme Court answer. It always depends, right? It's always the case example. And that's what justice is. I'm not going to make sort of a rule. That's why we have the system that we have today and not some other kind of coded system. Well, most states have it, except for some kind of coded system. So it really depends on what the equity are in the situation of each individual case. So that's part of what it is. But the assumption that I gave earlier is that it will be under the due process and following the rules, because in many cases, and the reason why the immigration system is what it is today is because the discretion that is needed, right, that any other officer may have in a traffic violation or in criminal court or whatever, isn't in the immigration court. right? There's just a hammer. And that hammer has created a backlog that doesn't need to exist. And while we talk about this part of immigration, I also want to remember that family is part of immigration, family immigration. And if that system were modernized, most of the people that we have in this other system would have made it through the family system. But when you say you need to wait 12 years to get an opportunity to get a visa, when you have an option to have it today, it seems ridiculous to me. You're at a nightclub with nobody inside, standing outside. And also the same thing with employment. We sort of limit the number of employment visas that we have. We tell our employers, you can have so many of these visas a year, and then everything else goes to another country. That's also not modern and the right way to sort of think about that. Why don't we let the market decide what that is, right? Why don't we sort of let the market decide what kind of immigrants we need? How can the government, with its antiquated system, tell a company like Apple or Google or anyone else who's operating above the fold what they need to meet their business needs?
That's a very fair question. Absolutely. So I'm curious about some of the other areas where AILA is advocating to that come to mind. Recent situation with Haitian refugees and Afghan refugees. Are there special challenges with those? Is it just, hey, this is yet another example of how the system isn't functioning the way it should? I'm just curious as to the advocacy on that.
Yeah, so our advocacy is always for just and fair immigration, regardless of who shows up in the room, right? We don't care, in many cases, we might go for a group, but we'll stay for everybody who's sort of caught up in that realm. And what, Karen has expressed about the Justice Campaign, that's part of fixing a problem. If we get the problem to start working, it'll fix for everybody across the board to sort of have better justice across the board. So while we have programs to address those spikes as they occur, they've always been part of the platform, right? Black immigrants, Muslims, the ban, all of those things have always been there to say, wait, this is inconsistent with the current INA, so therefore this can't stand. In addition, Congress, if you want to fix it, change this or modify this to address the need or the pull of it. And the reach of us as lawyers is that, we're generally the subject matter expert in the room, sort of saying, this is how this will impact that, because it's also important to understand how it impacts across the group, which speaks to one of the things that is important, that if nobody walks with anything else from this conversation, is to walk away from this pairing individuals against each other. And in immigration, there isn't a system where it's family or business or people who are attending immigrants who are applying for asylum at the port of entry, who are always called undocumented or illegal, because that just doesn't exist. We don't call people at consulates that, right? When people go to the consulate to apply for a visa, we don't say they're illegal. We don't say they're undocumented. Well, that's what the same people are showing up at the land border. So let's use our words across the board. So the conversation is not, how do we challenge these groups against each other for one spot? It's how do we build on all of these spaces to correct the system that we have? And that's why we have a huge backlog. If the system were working appropriately in any fashion, you wouldn't have a backlog across the board. But business visas are backlogged for years. And not because, even before COVID, forget COVID as a thing, right? Because that's most of our applications are processed by mail and through a process, but forget COVID as a thing. Even before COVID started, COVID exacerbated it, but it didn't create it. There were backlogs across the world in every level of immigration capacity. And once again, that is a choice. The first choice is saying, making such a few numbers of visas available, thinking that the United States is full when we're nowhere close to being full. I don't even know that conversation started with the concept of the United States being full, when per person, per square mile in this country is less than many other places in the world. And also the conversation that people are coming here to get something. Immigrants who come here get almost no public benefits at all, almost none across the board, none. In addition to that, for the conversation today, and for what Karen just gave you, almost clear from every report provided that immigrants are less likely to be involved in any crime over a native-born citizen. So therefore, the conversation that we're putting people in jail as criminals when they're looking for a right to come to this country criminalizes them, and it puts them in breeding grounds to make them turn to that society rather than allowing them to have the opportunity to feed the other part, right?
Got it. So Karen, one thing I'm curious about is, as the Immigration Justice Campaign is working towards ending the detention system itself, I have to imagine that there are things you're advocating for in the interim as well to improve quality of life or to improve access to justice. And so would love to know what some of those issues are. Let's start with access to justice, because you've mentioned that as well. So what is some of the work that you are doing with regard to that?
Sure. So there are a couple of ways in which we're tackling that issue right now. Fundamentally, it is, from the years of experience that we have doing this work, it is not possible to have a fair day in court if you're detained, like full stop. That being said, until we get rid of detention, it's critical to get lawyers in there, right? And so part of what we're doing right now is advocating for basic access to counsel and to having conversations with individuals in detention between lawyers and clients. So that's a big part of what we fight on a daily basis, which is that not only is it hard to find enough lawyers to actually serve the hundreds of thousands of individuals who are detained every year in very hard to reach locations, but even when lawyers are willing to do it, the barriers to even speaking to a detained client are enormous. And the proceedings in detention go so fast. They go much faster than on the non-detained docket. And so you have a situation where it's hard to talk to someone and the proceeding is moving very, very quickly. And so much happens in that black box of the detention center. Another access to justice thing, quite frankly, is access to our asylum system. Many of the individuals that we're serving in detention, as Alan has said, are coming here trying to access our asylum system. And it is lawful under our statutes to show up at a port of entry and say, I would like to apply for asylum. I am afraid to go home. That is lawful. But right now, our asylum system at the southern border is essentially closed. It is essentially shut down. And so a lot of the sort of difficulties accessing justice that we are talking about here, particularly for individuals who are seeking protection, come from the fact that our asylum system is broken right now. It's broken for a lot of reasons. It's broken because of terrible policies that the prior administration put into place that the current administration hasn't necessarily gotten rid of yet. It's in terrible condition because the Border Patrol and Customs and Border Protection do not allow attorneys into their holding facilities, full stop. It's broken for a lot of reasons. And a lot of our advocacy these days is really focusing on how do we restore and rebuild our asylum system. So those are just a couple of the access to justice things that we're tackling right now.
And I think, to Alan's point earlier, that also seems to ebb and flow with administrations. Karen, you sort of alluded to that, but it's, is this a priority for any particular administration, and what kind of resources does it get, or what kind of obstruction does it get, and doesn't even need to necessarily go far as obstruction, and just benign neglect even would impact the system as well.
Well, the political polarization that Alan talks about is, key to why this problem has not gone away and keeps getting worse, and we keep finding ourselves here. And so that is, a problem that we all have to be tackling every day.
This is not an easy question. And Alan, I'm going to start with you on this, because I suspect this might also be part of your advocacy. How do we change the conversation? Because, there's clearly education efforts. There are clearly organizations who are compiling the facts to get them out there. And that doesn't seem to be changing the conversation. So like I said, this is not an easy question at all, but what more should we be doing? What more do we need to be doing to change this conversation?
Well, I think the most important thing is that we understand that immigration isn't a silo issue, right? There are a lot of issues that we're faced with. And as we talked about before, as one person is just not a one issue person, society is not a one issue society. And so we have to show up for other people. So when we think about immigration, we think about racial justice, we think about economic justice. as we think about those things, we have to sort of work together, and it can't be a compete to say who gets something first when everybody sort of works together towards that end. And I think that's a very difficult thing to see, even now as we watch, bills that are wildly popular fail because each person is looking for one particular part of it to be first or to be at the same time. And progress for me as a person who studies civil rights in this country is incremental. Nothing's going to happen overnight in such a rapid form that it's actually going to change. And if it did happen overnight, you wouldn't believe that it's true because it could shift just the very same other direction. So that's part of the conversation. I think part of what is part of the immigration justice campaign is this place called belonging. And I think that that's important for us to start having conversations with people who don't have the immigration view, see it as a challenge, and to understand why they see it as a challenge. To say, okay, let's talk about it. Do you see it as a challenge, or are you told this is a challenge, right? So having more conversations about immigration as it reaches out to many people beyond the Beltway. Immigration used to be a very inside the Beltway sort of conversation. But now when you look for communities who are building themselves up by immigrants, right? And are also paying out of their own communities to pay for immigrants to have immigrant justice in some way, to have lawyers, to have representation from small towns and societies, or other places that are saying, look, the only reason that we're so popular is because we have immigrants. Look at Minnesota, right? I mean, as an example of a place that just has a fundamental foundation in an immigrant growth and just the people they elect to represent them. So those are part of the things of changing the conversation. And those things take time because there is no simple solution. And if there were a simple solution, then there really wouldn't be the problem that exists now. But because there's so many different fractions, we have to show up as we do as lawyers before the current court system, for the people that can't afford to represent, for people who can't and who need access to justice, between the Justice Campaign working with our partners there, sort of educating people on the knowledge of what's going on through the Immigration Counsel, and then also saying, listen, there's a place for all of us here. That's what we always celebrate when we say that we're a nation of immigrants. So let's have the conversation. Why do you think it's difficult? Why do you think that people showing up at the border is actually some kind of invasion, when every day hundreds of airplanes land at airports and nobody says, oh, that's an invasion? No, right? They say that's an airport landing, right? And it's a conceptual thing when you sort of think about it that way. And so that's part of what we need to do, is to change the conversation. And I think, as the one thing that I can say about it, the younger generation that has happened progressively with all sort of justice movements, is they are more welcoming and more understanding because they have friends who have been impacted by the movement.
That makes sense. All right. Before we get to our lightning round questions, which is how I like to close each of these conversations, I have two questions that I also like to ask our guests. And so the first is, with regard to immigration justice, what do you wish people were paying more attention to? And Karen, I'm going to start with you on that one.
Oof. Oh, so many things.
You can do a small laundry list if you want. It doesn't just have to be one thing.
I will do a small laundry list. A couple of things. I wish people were paying more attention to having conversations with people who don't necessarily agree with them. I wish, because I think that that's, as Alan said, critical to how we make long-term change and change the narrative long-term. I wish that people were paying more attention to the way in which racism is underlining so much of the enforcement apparatus that happens in immigration, that happens in our immigration system, and throughout our society generally. I wish people were paying more attention to the misinformation that is out there about immigrants and immigration. So those are just some of the things that I wish.
All right, Alan, same question for you. What do you wish people were paying more attention to?
I wish people were paying less attention to where someone was born and more attention to people as humans. That's just it.
Yeah, I like that. Okay. And then, Alan, I'm going to start with you on this question, because you kind of alluded to this, but what do you see as the biggest priorities to help close these equity gaps?
So there are two, and they're within our structural work. Judicially, an independent court. Legislatively, some reform in a positive. It's just some reform. It's been 35 years.
Okay. Karen, same question for you.
I think we need I hate to say it because I know people hate talking about it, but comprehensive immigration reform. We need that. We need to adjust our laws in order to really get us onto a sounder footing. And we need to look back at all of the ways in which, all of the things that are barriers to justice that don't make it into those big political conversations, that, so much of our litigation actually is focused on, which are those procedural inequities that people, don't see from the outside and, won't make it to the top of comprehensive immigration reform, but are what can make the difference between an immigration system with integrity and fairness and humanity, and one that railroads folks. So those are the two. We need to be doing both of those things together.
Great. Okay, now for the lightning round, which I confess is my favorite part. All right, Alan, I'm going to start with you on this question because you said progress takes time. But I'm going to ask you, if you had to think, what do you really hope could get done in the next year or two that would advance this conversation? So what progress do you hope can be made in the next year or two?
Immigration reform, 100%. A bill could be passed. Absolutely.
Okay. All right. That was easy. Karen?
I would say immigration reform and an actual functioning system of release from detention. Right now, it is completely at the discretion of individual ICE officers around the country who make decisions in very different ways. And there's an opportunity under this administration to really systematize that and get a functioning system of release that is transparent.
Okay. All right, Karen, then next question for you. What gives you hope that progress will be made?
I always have hope. Actually, what gives me hope is the day-to-day work that we do as lawyers. Quite honestly, what gives me hope is all of the people that we work with, the volunteers, the lawyers, the individuals in detention who just have such amazing resilience and strength. I'm always humbled by them, and that gives me hope.
Okay. Alan, same question for you. What gives you hope that progress will be made?
Yeah, it's a difficult time, but mostly I would say the movement of my organization, the growth that we've had since before for the 75 years, we grow monumentally to face the needs of people who are immigrating to this country. And we've seen over and over again, we've not had a single year in which we've had a decline in growth in the immigration bar. So that's something to always remember, to look for the helpers, and that we're continually rallying new helpers from law schools to join the population to meet this need.
As a Pittsburgh native, I appreciate the Mr. Rogers reference right there. So thank you for that. All right, Alan, I'm going to start with you on this one. Who else is doing good work towards that progress, towards closing those equity gaps?
I think a lot of communities are stepping up and saying, local communities, states, mostly townships are saying, wait a minute, these are my neighbors, and your problem with whatever you think immigration is not our problem. And either we're not going to enforce those immigration laws here, or we're going to do everything we can to help our society remain the same, because we don't care. You're making an issue out of something that's a non-issue for us.
Okay. All right, Karen, same
I
question.
fully agree with that. There's so much good that is happening at the local level. I would also add to that there are more campaigns out there that are really trying to tackle bringing people together over and to depolarize the situation. And so we belong to a campaign, for example, that is called Belonging Begins With Us. And I think that the more that we energize campaigns like this, the more progress we'll be able to make.
Something for our audience to look for in their own communities as well. All right, and then the final lightning round question, because we like to leave our audience with suggestions of ways they can educate themselves, how they can learn more. So Karen, I'm going to start with you on this one. Anyone you would recommend reading, listening to, podcasts, thinkers in general that you would recommend our audience check out?
So the American Immigration Council has a blog. I would definitely encourage everyone to sign up for that blog. It is at immigrationimpact.com. and that will keep you up to date on everything that is happening in the immigration world.
Okay. Perfect. Alan, what about you?
So,
Anybody you would suggest we read,
yeah,
pay attention to, listen to?
I am who I am. So follow me on Twitter, follow the executive director of AILA on Twitter, follow AILA on Twitter. We also have a blog called Think Immigration. Follow the Think Immigration blog. There's a bipartisan organization called the Bipartisan Council. Follow them on immigration. They put out stuff that's right down the middle. There's another organization called the Rational Middle that is basically having a lot of these grassroots conversations in different communities. Follow them right down the middle. And I think, and after you do all of those things, then go to the American Immigration Council site, find the Belonging Center, and participate in the activities that are created there to sort of galvanize these conversations. Because the only reason that we move forward on racial issues, on equity issues for people who are gay, lesbian, is because people started having conversations of saying, you know what, you're really not that different. And I understand what the issue is, and that really doesn't impact my life at all. So why do I care?
Okay. Well, thank you to our audience for joining us for tea today. An upcoming program note, join us again in 2 weeks for our next tea time with the Jackson Center on Thursday, November 18th at 3 p.m. Eastern. Our guest will be Steve Roth, the Executive Director of ORAM, the Organization for Refuge, Asylum, and Migration, which focuses on the special circumstances and needs of LGBTQ plus individuals in migration and refugees. That program will be pre-recorded and still be answered in the chat. And so we look forward to seeing you then. And Karen and Alan, thank you very much for joining us all for tea today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much.